Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks a lot for coming along today. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm Anna Hickey-Moody and I'm sort of hosting the event on behalf of Dirk. Dirk are really pleased to have Alison over. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Alison Harvey, who, as you probably know, is a lecturer in the School of Media, Communication and Sociology at the University of Leicester in the UK. So we've had a number of visitors at RMIT from Leicester. There's quite a healthy relationship between the two universities. So Mark Banks and Peter Lunt have both come over to visit. Hopefully some of you have met them while they've been here. And our Dirk postdoc, Jessica Nosk-Turner, has recently been appointed in Alison's department. So we're looking forward to sort of strengthening this relationship. So Alison's work focuses on issues of inclusivity and accessibility in digital culture, and she puts an emphasis on gaming in particular. So her work has appeared in a range of interdisciplinary journals, including the International Journal of Cultural Studies, Social Media and Society, and Feminist Media Studies. Alison's book, Gender, Age and Digital Games in the Domestic Context, was published by Routledge in 2015, and it's the first North American study of digital games at home. And her next book, Feminist Media Studies, is to be published by Polity in 2019. And here Alison focuses on the challenges and opportunities raised by digital media, including platform politics, online anti-sociality and networked activism. Alison's co-edited two forthcoming journal editions on inequality and ideology in games and digital cultures, and these are Ludic Economies for Games and Culture and Networked Injustice for Information, Communication and Society. Alison's also a co-investigator on a 5-year Social Science and Humanities Research Council grant of Canada, a partnership grant called Refiguring Innovation in Games. So can I ask you please to turn your phones off now if you haven't already, or switch them to silent? And I'd also like to let you know that this is being recorded. There'll be some question time at the end that will also be recorded. And if you're not okay with that, come and let me know and we'll edit you out. In the meantime, can I ask you to make Alison very welcome, please? Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for coming out on what is such a beautiful day that I'm sure having a picnic is a really tempting kind of prospect, and you're in a classroom with me. I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to be talking about the future of the games industry and games culture from the perspective and the starting point of looking at women's work, both simulated and in play. So this is not your typical approach to analyzing the functioning and development of one of the world's largest media and creative industries. For those of you who don't know, it's valued at now $125.4 billion on a global level, according to the market intelligence firm Newzoo. What I hope to have demonstrated by the end of my talk today is that this is a perspective that can provide insight into really significant trends in this field. Understanding where the games industry is at and where it's going is quite important even beyond game studies, because as Greg DePuter and Nick Dyer-Weatherford argued way back in 2003, games are the ideal commodity of the post-Fordist economy. Games have time and again been the bellwether of shifts in digital culture and labor, from the playful workplaces that are common in digital and tech firms now, to the rise of the gig economy, and also kind of hinting at the beginning of the rise of fascist discourse and online incivility. It's for this reason that I'm arguing that the Kardashian family and their forays into gaming have something worth considering to tell us about the future of the games industry and digital culture. And in particular, what I'm arguing to be the feminization of ludic engagement. To build this argument, first I'm going to give you a little bit of context through 3 moments in games. That's the mainstreaming of games play, the backlash and reconfiguring of gaming subjectivity based on this trend, and loot boxes, the biggest games controversy of 2017. Then I'm going to turn my focus to a mobile games app called Kim Kardashian Hollywood, though I'll also note that Kendall and Kylie have had their own successful forays into game development. Don't worry if you haven't played this particular game, although if you have, that's great too. I'm going to introduce you to its rules and its play experience, and then I'm going to use the game text and its reception as a way of understanding some broader issues related to digital games and women's work. Through this example, I hope to demonstrate the feminization of gaming and digital gaming and how it's working, and what its implications are more broadly. Okay, so our first moment. Games and gamers are everywhere. Unless you were living under a rock in the summer of 2016, you probably witnessed a scene like this one pictured here of hordes of people playing en masse in public Pokemon Go. This phenomenon reflects a broader trend in contemporary digital games culture. While there's been a fairly persistent negative stereotype about what games are like and who gamers are, statistics over the last decade in a range of different national contexts show us that the reality is actually a lot more heterogeneous. The fastest growing market of game players is actually women over the age of 35, who already outnumber the demographic of that imagined gamer, boys under the age of 18. This is significant because quite quietly, games have become the largest media industry in the world. To wit, the biggest media merger of 2015 wasn't orchestrated by Rupert Murdoch. It didn't involve Disney or Time Warner. It was the acquisition by Activision Blizzard, maker of World of Warcraft, of King Digital Entertainment, best known for Candy Crush Saga. This purchase cost $5.9 billion, and it means that the newly formed company is now one of the largest publishers and game networks in the world. So we can attribute this in no small part to the rise of mobile and smartphones in particular, and growing numbers of mobile game players. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the games industry and the mobile industry, and you can see that by looking at any of the lists of most downloaded or best-selling app lists on either iPhone or Android, where you'll see alongside Instagram and Facebook games like Temple Run, Angry Birds, Fruit Ninja, Candy Crush, and of course Pokemon Go. The status of this widening market and its increasing overlap with mobile technology and markets is a contested shift. In 2009, game scholar Jesper Juul claimed that 2006-2007 marked the beginning of a casual revolution in games. The Nintendo Wii and a range of mobile and social networking games diversified a landscape that was previously characterized by a big budget, time-intensive, and violence-oriented console and PC games like Call of Duty and Halo. Since that time, games culture has been the site of some venomous and vitriolic public reaction against women's participation in the area, whether they're being players, critics, journalists, academics, streamers, or producers. So while many see the broadening up of the range of games, play mechanics, and technologies of play as good for the industry and for the culture of games play, others see it as a threat. The most visible example of that perspective and its tenor and tone was the phenomenon known as Gamergate, the 2-year-long harassment campaign that focused on bringing back the good old days of games culture, including the exclusion of women. So it's worth noting that while Gamergate was the most widely visible instantiation of harassment against women in this domain, it was certainly not the beginning or the end of violently exclusionary practices in games culture. In fact, if you go back through the established body of games and gender research, as far back as 1985 to Kiesler, Spruill, and Eccles' article, Pool Halls, Chips, and War Games, Women in the Culture of Computing, you can see that that has a continuity all the way up until today in work on, for instance, online gaming, women in the games industry, women in esports. There's a persistent marginalization of women in games alongside an enduring participation of women in games. And the move towards more inclusive gameplay opportunities and the development of broader markets of players has not been welcomed universally. In fact, a great deal of both positive and negative discourse about this growing participation is underpinned by some ideas of essential difference between masculine and feminine play. As John Vanderhoof notes, this distinction is actually a hierarchy, with masculine hardcore play celebrated and feminine casual play framed as passive and less legitimate. Christopher Paul and Mia Consalvo have analyzed the traits associated with each of these labels, and as this very quickly pulled ACES ad shows, these are linked to value judgments around time and commitment, so playing or not playing enough of the right games or wrong games, economic investment, expertise, attachment to the medium, and understanding the social cues and codes related to games consumption. As this indicates, there is a tangled set of consumption practices and social characteristics to unpack, as you can obsessively play and develop high levels of expertise, which looks like hardcore play, but if it's not with the right game, then or expressed through incorrect vocabulary, it won't be read as legitimate, it'll be dismissed as casual. As Adrian Shaw notes, this is partly how claiming the identity of gamer has become quite complex, as it entails possessing and investing in the cultural capital that's recognized within gaming culture, a quite narrow set of characteristics. So what I want to flag up in this talk is how good old-fashioned material capital is a significant element of this categorization and recategorization of what gamers are, and essentially what girl gamers are on the other hand. So bullet 3 of this ACES ad, I don't know if you can read it with the light, indicates that part of the legitimacy or legibility of the gamer subject is also linked to modes of monetization. So It says on the hand of the hardcore gamer, you spent a small fortune upgrading your computer and it was totally worth it. On the casual gamer side, spending more than $5 on a game is a travesty. I'll wait for the sale instead. So this brings us to the third moment that I want to introduce to you, which is the loot box controversy of 2017. Hands up if you know what a loot box is. Hands up if you've opened up a loot box at some time in your life. Who paid some money for that loot box? These numbers shrink rapidly. I wonder, it'll be worth doing empirical research, I think, into the motivations of people buying loot boxes in the future. For those of you who aren't familiar with loot boxes, the ways that games have been sold, distributed, and consumed has changed pretty consistently with each so-called generation of games console and increasing technological convergence. That said, despite the shift from mono-purpose devices like the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to the integrated family entertainment systems such as PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, there's been a pretty long-standing trend of paying a substantial amount of money for a new game title. So for example, the recently released Shadow of the Colossus retails at EB Games for $55 Australian. The expectation is, according to Paolo Pedercini, that in return for this expenditure, a games purchaser can anticipate a very lengthy play experience measured in tens and hundreds of hours. However, with the rise in digital distribution via platforms such as Steam, Origin, social networking sites, and various app stores, there's also been a number of shifts in the political economy of games, as well as the creation of new genres of play experience, as we'll see with the Kim Kardashian Hollywood example a bit later. In a relatively short period of time, games have shifted from being what is called the razor and blades model of profit, which is selling costly to produce consoles at a loss and then recouping those profits from software sales, into what's more like a service model. Game universes and engagement with them are extended through the sale of expansion packs and downloadable content, or DLC. Taking the lead from theme parks and sporting events, publishers have begun selling season passes, offering exclusive early access and discounts on DLC. All of this represents new and much needed revenue streams for the games industry, which relies really heavily on the successes of very expensive to produce blockbuster IP to sustain itself. Games are getting more costly and complex to develop and market, making game development increasingly high risk and increasingly creatively conservative as well. So loot boxes are part of another facet of these developments in monetization, microtransactions, which are familiar from outside of games as well. These are very low price expenditures within a game, allowing the player to acquire virtual items that would otherwise be really slow, difficult, or impossible to acquire through play. Despite the fact that these are micro in scale, typically between 99 cents and $10 to buy, the sale of items within the industry, which they call player recurring investments, they made Ubisoft 318.5 million euros in the last 9 months. As this shows, these represent high margin returns, particularly as they do not require any marketing or research and development to sell. So they're therefore quite a growing trend in the games industry. Loot boxes derive their name from the original games as service model, massively multiplayer online games, wherein once you defeated enemies, you could pillage them for loot, which is random prizes that could at times be very valuable and rare items. Loot boxes are stylized as crates or boxes, and they're generated randomly, and once they're open, they disappear, allowing the player to receive a range of prizes, from small amounts of currency to customization options to weapons or armor. The monetization element comes from two features of these in-games. One, that the player can buy the boxes rather than wait for them to appear in play, and two, that the player may then need to purchase keys to unlock and redeem these crates. So this is like a really brief introduction to monetization in games culture, but it should indicate to you that loot boxes are not a shockingly new phenomenon, but still they were a hot topic amongst players and critics in 2007. In particular, the AAA blockbuster game Star Wars Battlefront II received a great deal of negative coverage because of its inclusion of loot boxes. In the news coverage about what about Star Wars Battlefront II was especially problematic, I found several recurring themes. There's a sense that the game is designed around this monetization strategy, rather than having an economy built around another, I guess, somehow less tainted core mechanic. Progression within the game was inextricably linked to loot boxes, and the play experience felt like a grind or a slog unless you had the money to pay for them. To quote Ben Kuchera of Polygon, quote, "This wasn't a system that was designed for fun as much as it was designed for profits." Monetization strategies like the use of loot boxes have been called pay-to-play, which is a slightly odd misnomer since you always pay to play, but it refers to how the progression in a game is eased by payment. The way Star Wars Battlefront II integrated loot boxes into the games led to criticism that the game was more of a pay-to-win title, requiring players to expend money to advance through play. So what I want to do with the time that I have remaining to me is contextualize this controversy and challenge the dominant discourses related to value and legitimacy that arise around it, not by looking at similar practices. For instance, baseball card packs would be a similar kind of tactic, or skin trading in other mainstream games like Overwatch. Instead, I want to make explicit how these changes in game design around monetization have actually been the norm for many years in games that are designed explicitly for women, basically since the casual revolution began. Kim Kardashian Hollywood, for me, is a really interesting example of this. I heard about Kim Kardashian when it appeared on Game of the Year lists in 2014, which was quite a surprising kind of game to see appear on those lists. They typically celebrate, really big expenditure blockbuster games with high-end graphics and sophisticated AI. So you don't expect to see a freemium title appearing on those lists, especially because this is actually a reskinned version of the game Stardom Hollywood, released by developer Glue Games, which brands itself the leader in 3D freemium mobile gaming. So freemium refers to the fact that these games are free at the outset, but you can accelerate or improve your play experience through microtransactions. Initially, I played the game just out of curiosity, and I wanted to see what it was like to play that game without spending any money. I wanted to see how the design of the game encouraged or enforced microtransactions. And so the longer version of this paper is going to be published in Games and Culture, and that special issue in Ludic Economies. And in that paper, I kind of untangle the relationship between digital culture and celebrity culture. What I wanted to talk about today was looking at this game in light of Kuchera's genre critique, what it looks like when a game is, quote, designed around economics, and in particular, what and how it simulates the world through this mechanic. So, Kim Kardashian Hollywood. Did anyone here play this game? Yes. I played a lot of this game. I played this game for 2 years. I didn't mean to. You? It was a sticky game. Yeah, a while. Okay, so it's a relatively straightforward play to describe. In Kim Kardashian Hollywood, you begin as a shop clerk, and then you're discovered by real-life superstar Kim Kardashian, and from there you work your way up from the unknowns of the E-list to the fame of the A-list by gaining as many fans as possible. It's interesting to note that when you make your character, you're already framed as a star. Innately, you have that ability to become a celebrity. As you play the game, what becomes clear that what happens between being a star and becoming a celebrity is lots and lots of work. First in the shop where Kim Kardashian discovers you, and then onward to making appearances, modeling, acting in TV commercials, reality TV and films, acting as a spokesperson for brands and causes, managing businesses, including shops and clubs, bartending, travel writing, and dabbling in interior design, to name a few. She's a bit like Barbie, she has all the careers. Through these activities, as well as dating other celebrities and acquisitions of clothing, accessories, homes, decorations, cars, pets, and children, you gain fans. In other words, your avatar, like Kim Kardashian herself, rises to fame by building a successful brand via engagement in an ever-expanding and global range of promotional and licensing activities. Though in this game, you do not produce a sex tape. So KKH is an exemplar of a new genre of games that have emerged in the mobile field called Invest Express. This is not a type of game that existed on console or PC games. In this type of game, play is premised on player customization and personalization within the game world, the Express feature. And you do that through successful management of time both within and outside the game world, as well as strategic investment of attentional and financial capital, the invest element. This is a fairly straightforward relation that in the case of KKH is built around the pursuit of becoming a star. So why then was this free-to-play game so tremendously successful? It was downloaded 40 million times in 2015, and in-app purchasing led to $71.8 million in sales in the same year. It was also acclaimed as genius in venues such as the Atlantic. I was really curious to know. One way to understand the response to the game is through an analysis of its procedural rhetoric. So for those of you who don't study games, games within their goal systems and mechanics embed ideological arguments about how the world works. As Ian Bogost writes in Persuasive Games, quote, "Video games are not just stages that facilitate cultural, social, or political practices. They're also media where cultural values themselves can be represented for critique, satire, education, or commentary." So games are argued to be not representational systems in the same way as films, but computational texts. Their unique attribute is that they're based on processes, and through that they express meanings through causal interactions. In other words, games can make arguments about how the world works by showing rather than telling, which makes them, I think, quite potent for expression. What the basic gameplay of Kim Kardashian Hollywood simulates is a clear path from nobody to the upper echelons of celebrity. It operates through a seductive post-feminist cultural logic. So by post-feminist, I'm referring to what Angela McRobbie does as a kind of cultural logic or sensibility that frames young women as free from structural barriers to their success as long as they work hard. Post-feminism is therefore a meritocratic discourse, emphasizing the activities and self-discipline of individual subjects and their access to social mobility and attainment, just as long as they're dedicated enough. But this dream of control, freedom, and agency through hard work is challenged by the ludic economy of the game itself, which I'm going to introduce you to now. As with all ludic economies, scarcity is a key principle in Kim Kardashian Hollywood. Structural barriers to achievement are not linked to racism or sexism in this virtual world, but instead to the depletion of your set amount of energy at any given point. The push and pull mechanic of the game is related to the renewal and exhaustion of that key currency of energy. So what happens is your energy is diminished with any given task that you conduct, and then you have to wait for your energy to renew to continue whatever job you're completing at a rate of 1 energy every 5 minutes. The fundamental challenge in Invest Express games is that the tasks are time limited as well. So you can run out of time before you accrue enough energy to get 5 stars on an event. You must therefore leave the game, wait for the energy to renew, and then return within a set period to successfully progress. A mode of play that the player quickly learns can conflict with periods of non-connectivity, such as in your commute or if you're in a meeting. I have to tell you that when I was playing this game, I would set alarms for myself to remind me to go back into the game to finish it. So the player subject is presumed to have flexible temporalities related to work and leisure within the game's functionalities. The same principle applies to the other forms of currency within the game, which accrue slowly through gameplay. Cash is awarded for completing tasks in increasing abundance, while K-stars, which are the game's exclusive and rare currency, you can amass a little bit through gameplay, but not enough to do the things that you would like to do with them. So you can see these are at the top here: energy, cash, and K-stars. And K-stars they're extremely rare in the game. So you can save up for cash-based express elements within the game, but you won't ever get enough of those K-stars that are tied to more exclusive items just by playing. This is significant because acquisition within the game is crucial. You'll be asked while you're playing to acquire particular items, such as specific virtual boots or handbags, that require more of this currency than you would be able to collect in any kind of non-paid play. So their purchase isn't essential. I did get to the A list without buying any of those K-stars, but as Ruth Curry notes in her review of the game, your experience is vastly improved if you do buy them, because then you can skip through that kind of play that feels like a grind. Within Kim Kardashian Hollywood, there are many in-game encouragements and solicitations for the expenditure of offline currency, where players are encouraged to click on cash, K-star, and energy packs from the Star Shop, where there are bundled deals that also variously include bonuses in the form of ad-free play and VIP daily rewards. So in-game purchasing seamlessly links with your credit card information in the Google Play or App Store, allowing you to gain quantities of in-game currency that would take a great deal of time to collect for super low prices. There are also alternative modes of earning additional currency in the game, and this is something I did do. So by watching third-party advertisements or going to their websites or other click-based activities like surveys, or downloading or interacting with other kinds of apps, you could get extra money or extra energy, in-game cash, that is. The accumulation of these in-game currencies is not incidental to play, but fundamental to the pursuit of fans. Free play, even if you engage in it through the sale of your eyeballs with those alternative income streams, is insufficient if you want to acquire the most exclusive in-game express items, such as luxury housing, sports cars, or the adoption of babies or pets. As this indicates, the invest element of the game is tied to a mixed ludic economy of time and capital, which results in a unique class politics of the microtransaction. While it's not a social game, there's been a move from social networking games to time-based games that Share Chess writes about. KKH does include special promotional events allowing for comparison and competition with other app users, such as fashion contests, which reaffirms the value of rare, expensive, and difficult to attain in-game items, and the resemblance of virtual social status and cultural capital to those familiar with offline micro-celebrity culture. In this way, the egalitarianism of the game noted in terms of that express feature, that post-feminist dream, is belied by the aspirational element of the invest characteristics of the game. These mechanics reinforce a hierarchy linked to class and socioeconomic status through required attainment of elite designer goods and access to exclusive venues. So as this indicates, the mechanics, dynamics, and modes of engagement entailed within Invest Express games stratify players through their ludic economies, creating their own variants of freeloaders who play with found in-game resources. For instance, within Kim Kardashian Hollywood, you can go click around on objects like fire hydrants, and they will pop out $1 bills. And so that's a freeloader of that game, whereas there's also these big spending digital whales that can bypass that kind of work and bypass the hard work that's implied in meritocracy. Through particularly affective pleasures, Kim Kardashian's entry into mobile game design represents a really successful extension of the commodification of the celebrity self within virtual worlds, creating new modes of profit in the attentional economy. But it's important to note that this isn't only facilitated by the expansion of celebrity culture, but also by shift in the conceptual and practical boundaries between finance and play, as Joyce Goggin has noted, wherein affective engagement becomes both work in the invest feature and reward in the express feature. This has been integrated quite fully in games like Kim Kardashian Hollywood, which makes the criticism of loot boxes and blockbuster games look slightly naive, actually. As I mentioned, this game was a financial success. However, despite astonishment about how this game captured the interest and wallets of players, the response to the game in the mainstream media was heavily critical. So when I said that The Atlantic called it genius, it wasn't really made in admiration, but more in awe. Kim Kardashian, meanwhile, has laughed her way to the bank, as predicted, making the cover of Forbes along the way. But the game has been, and this is not an exaggeration, thoroughly vilified. So author Ayelet Waldman decried the game as, quote, vile and pure evil, a characterization that was eagerly shared across venues like Gawker, Time, and Business Insider. So if you look at the media coverage of Kim Kardashian Hollywood, you'll see those words appearing quite a lot. Ruth Curry wrote a think piece about the reception of the game and found that this scorn cannot be disentangled from criticism of Kardashian herself for being famous for nothing or famous for being famous. This is exemplified but not limited to Kim Kardashian, as female celebrities tend to be much scrutinized for their fame. This critical surveillance tends to be related to doubts about the value of giving fame to those who are seen as undeserving, famous for being famous rather than for achievement or ability. As Kim Allen writes, female celebrity bodies are the constant object of disciplinary scrutiny related to their authenticity, challenged should they appear, quote, contrived, artificial, phony, as well as trying too hard and not being themselves. So you're in an impossible position when you're a celebrity. Being a digital culture researcher rather than a celebrity culture researcher, reading this literature was really striking because of the similarity between these critiques that are made of women who are visible. As Joseph Riegel notes in his discussion of the fake geek girl discourse, women are framed as receiving undue attention based on their erotic capital, including sexual attractiveness, beauty, and social skills, something that strikes me as pretty much identical to this disdain that you see for the female celebrity. Kim Kardashian is famous, of course, because she's a successful businesswoman, but her labor is vilified because it's feminine, emotional labor, smiling, looking pretty, and being charming, welcoming, and accommodating. This celebrity, and that which you create within the game, is what results from being paid for women's work, an unveiling of previously invisible labor that's apparently discomforting to those who must now see it. In its form and functioning, then, Kim Kardashian Hollywood makes visible the labor underlying celebrity culture and its spreading practices of self-branding, intimacy work, and hypervisibility in the attentional economy, making it impossible to ignore the intensity of women's work therein. It therefore reveals the labor that sustains low-status activities, both feminine play and celebrity practices, and challenges their devaluation. This emphasis on legitimacy brings us back to games culture, where women's participation is also evaluated and then devalued in a cultural economy of attention. Celebrity and digital games share a heightened affective debate about authenticity, so about real bodies, real celebrity, and real talent on one hand, and real games, real gamers, and real gameplay on the other. These disputes come together around Kim Kardashian Hollywood. So much effort in both realms goes into discussing and debating the legitimacy of women's leisure, participation, visibility, and labor. We can understand the scorn partly from a kind of traditional understanding of women's roles in the production consumption chain as passive consumption, and therefore men as the real bearers of talent, expertise, skill, and knowledge, and that's happened across the board in terms of game development. This serves to reify that deep cultural association between active, passive, male, female consumption production. Part of this is also due to the pressure to keep invisible that labor that is necessary to progress in a post-feminist popular media culture. What has to be naturalized is a complex constellation of affective labor, represented within the activities of Kim Kardashian Hollywood as well as in the life of her namesake. This includes the emotional labor of constructing intimacy with fans and followers, the glamour labor of managing a stylish appearance on and offline, the playbor of working virtually in and through a digital game, and on top of this, authenticity work all the time. So despite its successes, Kim Kardashian Hollywood as a game remains a low-status object, even with its celebrity endorsement, incredible sales, and relatively high production values. Through this, it stands in tension with the post-feminist vision of advancement that it puts forth, demonstrating the flaws of its own procedural rhetoric through its cultural reception. So by tracing the relationship between the play experience and discourse about Kim Kardashian Hollywood, I hope is becoming clear is that the critiques that have been levied at loot boxes in games like Star Wars Battlefront II are something that you wouldn't have been surprised about at all if you were paying attention to games that were designed for women and the criticism of them. In fact, there's a great deal more nuance in the reflection on these games than these games are built on economics. How terrible. Kim Kardashian Hollywood has been the subject of think pieces appearing in the New Inquiry and Brooklyn Magazine, as well as excellent critical analysis from research, including Shira Chess and Audrey Annable. And they've interrogated in particular the simulation of women's work and undervalued emotional labor. As Chess notes, the growth in the monetization and temporalization strategies of games like Kim Kardashian Hollywood herald the increasing feminization of this media form, which has numerous implications for the future of both digital play and media work. So news coverage of the loot box debacle has focused pretty much on the regulatory outcomes of a potential reframing of games that includes the randomized element of paid content and the worry that this is going to be now classified as gambling. There are other implications, however, that I think underlie the uproar related to what is framed as pay to win in blockbuster games. This is the blatant challenge that this design represents to the vision of meritocracy that's underpinned competitive game design and has been so heavily policed in reactions to a range of shifts in games, making them more accessible. So for example, I want to take you back to 2012, when Jennifer Hepler, who was a former writer at BioWare, was viciously attacked on Reddit for an interview that she had given in 2006. 6 years later, they come to get you. In that interview, Hepler talked about trends in gaming that were leading to greater inclusivity and greater acceptance of women in gaming as both fans and creators. She said that her favorite part of gaming was the stories and writing them, and that she didn't enjoy games with a heavy emphasis on hand-eye coordination, and in her minimal free time, because of family commitments, she wasn't able to enjoy long games. She said, quote, if there was a fast-forward feature on games which would let me easily review the writing and stories and skip the features that I find more frustrating than fun, I'd find it much easier to keep abreast of what's happening in the field. So she was basically proposing an inverse of what you can do now, which is like skip the story to get to the battle. She wanted to skip the battle to get to the story. The internet rage that ensued from this late discovery of her interview indicated that some gamers are very invested in battling against making games more accessible because of the prestige that comes from playing a game all the way through on the most technically difficult mode. It's become hegemonic within games culture to value certain kinds of play more highly based on the idea that winning is a byproduct of overcoming difficult challenges, putting the work in, building up your skills, and vanquishing the most technically strenuous tasks. As Kuchera notes in regard to Star Wars Battlefront II, the furor around loot boxes that gamers dislike the idea of, quote, buying an advantage they haven't earned. Loot boxes therefore challenge the ideal of meritocratic play by revealing its cruel optimism, how social mobility and possibilities have been accompanied by intensified inequalities in wealth. KKH reflexively and ironically makes this visible through the example of celebrity culture, a scene that plays on myths of everydayness, worklessness, and possibilities for obtaining incredible material and symbolic rewards. As game developers and publishers turn to the high margin returns of the microtransaction, they create a friction with closely held values related to authenticity, legitimacy, and above all, fairness in competitive neoliberal capitalism, which is what most of these games simulate even in their most fantastic settings. They introduce instead a new reality, where unless you're lucky, working hard for a long time will never get you the gains of those who have more material wealth to invest in the ludic world. In sum, Kim Kardashian Hollywood's mixed reception is a result of its affront to meritocratic dreams in games and how it simulates women's work and reveals rather than obscures low-status labor. In this way, it's an exemplar of what new ludic economies and features such as loot boxes can indicate about the future of digital games, that these are all feminizing. So when I use the term feminizing, I'm not unfortunately referring to some sort of inclusive expansion of games. Instead, I'm using the term in the sense that Donna Haraway did way back in 1991 to refer to shifts in the labor force in advanced capitalism. Work has been restructured in a manner that broadly resembles the traits and attributes once associated with jobs that were only literally taken up by women. So I'm going to quote Haraway here. Work is being redefined as both literally female and feminized, whether performed by men or women. To be feminized means to be made extremely vulnerable, able to be disassembled, reassembled, exploited as a reserve labor force, seen less as workers than as servers, subjected to time arrangements on and off the paid job that make a mockery of a limited workday, leading to an existence that always borders on being obscene, out of place. So this concept is linked not exclusively to the deskilling of labor, nor is it belied by emerging highly skilled jobs taken on by both men and women. Instead, it refers to the integration of the home, factory, and market on a mass scale, enabled by new technologies. So what then is the future of games to be predicted based on these tendencies towards class-stratified design mechanics? I am necessarily ambivalent. I toy here with the idea of automation. We already have, as Sonia Fizek's work shows us, fully automated idle background games that play themselves. Almost an inversion of the promise of automation that would free us from work to have more leisure time, presumably to play games. Certainly we can observe some fairly ruthless behavior manipulation in the design of mobile games like Kim Kardashian Hollywood, including a tendency to juicy affective engagement, gamification, and nudge behavioralism, filling every free second with clicks and taps. But the relationship between games, play, capital, and work has always been contradictory. And there may be something to be optimistic about in the potential destabilization of a bastion of hyper-masculine competitiveness and a global media empire. If pay-to-win becomes a necessary move of the unsustainable production model of AAA, and this is the profit model that topples over the saturated industry that's largely stagnated in its innovation, this may be the opportunity for something new to grow in its ashes. There are already a wide range of creative makers involved in games development that haven't been recognized in either mainstream or indie that will be ready to step in with their games. So we won't be without any games if that's the case. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a fantastic talk. So we've got some time for questions, and I might bring the little mic over to record the questions as well so that we can hear. So who would like to start us off? I can do an icebreaker question. So as someone who knows my post-feminism pretty well and have taught feminist media studies for years, ludic economies is not something that has entered my world. Can you talk a bit about what you mean when you use that phrase?
Yeah, so this is a term that Seth Giddens has come up with and that a couple of people have been working on, which is to refer to this kind of blending, the kind of ambiguous and ambivalent contradictions of labor and play in the contemporary economy. So work that tries to challenge those binary understandings of what's been going on and try to bring to the fore these kind of contradictions around the mixing of what was once understood to be completely separate from productive kinds of work, play, to kind of understand the ways in which, for instance, play is embedded in a range of economic trends, as well as how economic trends have become embedded within play. Yeah. Thanks. No worries. I did see a hand over there.
Thank you. I really appreciate the pushback on the kind of latent meritocratic rhetoric behind the loot box controversy. But to kind of ask the leading question, so I was just thinking that through, and this reflects my own biases, but is that maybe also even a critique of the, if we follow this even further, is this almost even a critique of the concept of procedural rhetoric? I'm thinking about your points at the end of is KKH self-aware or ironic? And that, I would say maybe aesthetically or morally is kind of the point here. Is a game like KKH challenging this problematic rhetoric of perfect meritocracy? Is that making that challenge clear to the player, or is it really ironic or not? Seems to be the discussion. And if that is the discussion, right, that's not actually just an artifact or a effect of game mechanics. It's also the writing and the how does the game successfully sell itself to the player that it's kind of doing that irony or a critique or something? So then that almost means like, well, okay, is even this like neat concept of the ludic so useful here if what we're actually discussing is a kind of like aesthetic tone or self-awareness of the game or something. So anyway, that's just like, I totally agree and really appreciate and would like to actually cite your argument, but I'm just wondering if we keep thinking that through, is the whole idea of procedural rhetoric even limited in terms of like analyzing this game? All right, I'll shut up.
I think that's a really good question. I was interested in looking at the like 3 levels around that game. So looking at mechanics, but also the reception and also the economics to try to set those in conversation. So I would say procedural rhetoric is useful to a certain extent in analyzing an app that is playful at its core. But I think what became more interesting for me is setting it into conversation with those other kind of dynamics and tensions around it. And so I'm not really sure if it was intentionally ironic. That's certainly the positive reading of it, but it's hard to say. Like, this is just one way of interpreting it. It does operate around monetization in a way that's very different from Star Wars Battlefront, for instance. Like there is I think a little bit more awareness around monetization that could be read as like a playful kind of satirical approach. But I have no access to the game designers to know more about it.
The reason I ask is because I'm a designer. So for me, it's always thinking about like, okay, well, if I'm designing one of these games and I want to make that deliberate consequentiality, like how do you try to sell that to the player or something? So maybe the question is coming from for me, a design point of view rather than the purely theoretical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think as a designer, you know that it's like, even if you embed those things within the procedural rhetoric, whether they're read as such, right? Like going back to the example of Monopoly, which was supposed to be a critique of capitalism, but it's not. It's not been taken up in that way. Yeah.
In a lot of these games, they tend to use emotional manipulation as another form of sort of motivation. How does that kind of fit into the framing? So particularly shame in KK and other women-targeted games or young women-targeted games like Choices, Episodes, all those sorts of things. Can it use those sorts of emotional manipulation to help you kind of conform to the universe that they've created? So how does that play into the sort of model that you're kind of talking about here?
I'm so glad that I swear I didn't plant her in the audience, because that's the longer paper. I could have talked at you for a really long time. So the bit that's not in here is more about the express element and how it motivates microtransactions specifically through affective appeal. So on the one hand, this kind of positive encouragement, reinforcement that Kim is doing herself through her avatar, as well as through like those phone calls that she makes to you sometimes, which is a really interesting kind of parasocial relationship that you get to have with her. But also through that kind of shame element, right? So if you don't log into the game for a while, even if you don't have an ongoing task, when you come back, there will be, aside from a plummeting in amount of fans, this kind of critique of like, where have you disappeared to? How could you have not been more loyal to us? Like, there's so many variants on this shaming and this guilt that happens. So there's like this interesting tension, and I think that's really interesting for looking at games too, is like, how is the emotional appeal working in tandem with things like that juicy feedback to keep you in the game, to keep you motivated, to keep you connected to the design of the game. I think it's going to be a growing area of interest, and I encourage, you said that you come from a feminist media studies perspective. Like, part of my mission is to get more people who don't look at games to look at games, because I think it could add interesting levels of critique than what comes from within game studies too.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. I'm just wondering, from an autoethnographic experience of you playing this game over 2 years, did you have any changes in terms of your values and how you thought of Kim Kardashian and I guess the feminine effective labour that you talked about?
I think so. I think I have a growing respect for Kim Kardashian, which, I think I think that was like the primary outcome. Also, it was interesting. I've never done an analysis of a game text before, and I don't know if that came through. It's not like normally I look more at people, but it was, from an ethnographic perspective, it was very bizarre because it became entrenched in weird ways in my relationships with other people. So when I first started playing the game, I was at home visiting my mom, and it's doing this thing where these push notifications are reminding me that my task is going to end, my gig is going to end in 10 minutes, and I'm at the airport saying goodbye to her, and I'm like, oh, she's going to buy me a coffee. This quick opportunity, I can finish this task. And she comes back and she goes, oh, is that Kim calling? Like, this is how quickly it became embedded in my interactions with people, that like it was like a familiar thing, that I was like grabbing my phone, not because like another person was texting me, but because Kim was contacting me. So otherwise, I'm not really sure, but it was an interesting experience. And I would say that I have never been so invested in a game text before. So I haven't really thought about it all the way through, but it's an interesting question.
Hi, this is quite a different area to what I'm familiar with, but in hearing you speaking, it sounds like you're being groomed. As within the context of a game, you're actually being groomed to do certain things, to behave in certain ways. It's just a thought, as in terms of listening to you speak. Would you like to comment on that?
You know, I think anybody would resist. I'm not being groomed, but I would say like that absolutely. Like you hear a lot about like addiction as a kind of critique being made of games, but I think that there's something a lot more interesting going on in terms of immersion, engagement, and behavioralism. Like, and this is something that I don't see studied quite that much in games, which is, I don't know if it's because we're all really reticent to be accused of those kinds of things, like bad taste in our mouth from the violence debates and things like that, but there is definitely things going on, in particular in the mobile games, that is very much based in, I think, psychology of engagement and keeping people really connected to that world and remaining within it for a long period of time. And I think the best research that's come out on this has focused on these kinds of low status, low value games. But I think maybe with the loot box, more people will be paying attention to it in other kinds of games as well. I will say that, I'm not too sure what I did. Okay. The loot box controversy came to my attention not because I saw it advertised, like these articles didn't register with me right away. It was because I was doing a talk at a games program, and that's what they were all worried about. So this was in December 2017, and they were like, what do you have to say about loot boxes? What do you have to say about loot boxes? Like, and I was like, when I was like, what are they? And they told me, I was like, this has been happening for ages. What do you, so like really, it's a complete lack of awareness about other kinds of trends and in particular what's going on in mobile. And so I think like that point that you're making furthers the point that like more people need to be studying the design techniques that are going on in those games, because they're going to be spreading outward.
Let me just hold this. Sorry, I've been noticing that in your talk, right, the way that you describe loot boxes, I think one point that might be mentioned is that there's a slight difference between loot boxing in a kind of a single player context, like in KKH, where loot boxes are in and microtransactions, but they don't affect the overall multiplayer community as a whole. Whereas in comparison in Star Wars Battlefront, one of the reasons for it being such a controversy was that players with access to more resources and cash inevitably gains an advantage over the rest, and that was actually part of the major issue of controversy. And that was also something that was taught, that I learned when I was growing up as a game developer as well, is that Andrew Gower, the founder of RuneScape, did say that he was very against it because he felt that social economic status of a player shouldn't be affected by their real world status. Every player in a game should be able to experience a similar experience without having to worry about their real world status as well. So I'm just wondering if you might have something to say like about loot boxing beyond cosmetic and in gameplay changes as compared to like just more narrative and single player context.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about it, because I think that ideal around, it should always be an equal playing ground for players has actually never been true. I think there's always been opportunities for players to gain advantage. Mia Consalvo wrote about this way back in 2007 as a constitutive element of the game's culture, about where players have gained advantage in like various degrees. And so I think it is an ideal of design that everyone is on the same playing ground, but it's not really been the case across the board. I do think there's an interesting distinction to be made in terms of social play and what the stakes are around gaining advantage in that way versus a game like Kim Kardashian Hollywood that is largely happening within this kind of like individual experience, aside from those like few kinds of outward contacts. But it's not just cosmetic is the thing that I'm trying to, I guess, express, is that Invest Express, the cosmetic is a key dimension of the game. So it's not just nice to have, it is like fundamental to the kind of pursuit of the highest levels of the game. So you can get to almost all the way there. You can get to the A-list without spending money. I did. even though I watched those ads. I'm pretty sure I could have gotten there even if I hadn't watched those ads. But you'll never get to number 1, ever, ever, ever. Did you get to number 1? You're like, it's impossible. Maybe Kim Kardashian herself is number 1, but you can't get to number 2. Like, you'd have to engage in those microtransactions. Does that get at your answer at all?
Are there any other questions? I was about to just, in terms of multiplayer ones, Galaxy of Heroes is an example of a multiplayer game that uses loot boxes as a core mechanic. So I think it's prevalent across all things. It's a mobile game, not a console game.
Do you think that there could be interesting intricacies in the distinction between like a social game and the single player game?
I think there is, but it is definitely, I mean, you can't get certain characters which have certain powers and certain achievements without paying for the box, which is a card, which is a loot box. It's a randomized reward system based on shards. But yeah, they're multiplayer games. They're competitive games that still use that loot box mechanic. Just they're on mobile.
Just bouncing off of that, like Riot's super interesting with the skins, right? This goes back to your point, like some people who've got the stock standard skin when you're going into a competitive match, you don't get the role you want, you don't get the network you want, you get treated in a completely different way. So sort of that effective work of that skin, which is cosmetic, does a lot of work. So you'll find that the top players are really quickly buying up those skin sets to move them forward in all sorts of other ways.
As a designer, I think that's, I also love to cite that. I think that's a super valuable pushback, this idea of the cosmetic purchase is, or pushing back on the idea that the cosmetic purchase is fundamentally, like, that's where this term ludic seems really narrow, that like, it always wraps it back to the culture around the game. We'll always like ludify, or whatever term you want to make. Like, I think so much traditional games studies wants to clearly separate the like ludic from the cultural layer around it. That it's precisely this case study, like I was adding. So yeah, I think that's such a valuable.
It's interesting for you that the ludic is so tightly tied, because I guess for Seth and I, why we like ludic economies rather than game economies is to try to get at that kind of playification of lots of different parts of the world. And the overlap with in-game as well. So for you and I, it has, I guess, a different resonance. Is there a term for you that would get at that better than ludic?
No, in fact, I think, well, it's my own hobby argument. I think the world is like really ready for like different term making there. But I think about something like Zimmerman and Salem's like classic like overview of game design for students, and does make. I mean, it's a really useful book, but it does make that clear difference between the kind of like game system layer, they call it, and the like cultural layer. But actually what we're talking about here is much more messy resonance effects between them. And so sure, maybe we can kind of redefine the term ludic, but like, yeah, God, what is that?
Yeah.
Messier,
No, I think we all grapple with the same thing. I bristle when I hear meta play right now still, right? Because again, that sort of slicing of distinction between this thing happening over here and this game happening over here. So, and it's just again how you're writing that up, how does that lens look, and your intention is really crystal clear why that's important to use ludic. So, depending on where you are.
Yeah, it's hard to get words that help you with messiness.
It is.
Yeah.
I think even just making that distinction. Well, hold on, this mainstream game design truism that like cosmetic improvements are like more ethical than like, I think it's a really valuable, super timely pushback. I'd love more people to hear this.
More people to write about it. Yeah, as well.
I think we have another question over here. I'm going to talk about cosmetics and skin, but in a totally different way. Following on from my question about the value systems and like when I watch the Kim Kardashian show, I feel like I would get more materialistic if I watched it a lot. Like I want to get like facial peels and buy expensive bags. Did you find any of your own consumption habits changing, or the ways you value things changing?
I do not have the material resources to be like the Kardashians.
Even like the way you get ready in the morning?
No, but I will tell you that I played the Kendall and Kylie game as well, kind of interested in like how it simulates girlhood and this kind of like girlish aesthetic. So if you compare, did anybody play both? Did you? Yeah. They're interesting to compare as texts, right? Because they're definitely you don't know who's playing these games, and I did not study who's playing these games, but the ideal player subject is a really interesting thing to consider. Like, how do we know who it is? How do we know that like Kendall and Kylie was definitely aiming at a different kind of younger subject? And to answer your question, I learned a lot about slang that I didn't know about and started using it based on Kendall and Kylie. So love you 5 ever. Love you even more than 4 ever. Love you 5 ever. Yeah, this is now entered into my discourse. But none of my consumption practices changed, sorry.
Thanks so much for coming along. And yeah, feel free to stick around and have a chat if you want to talk about your own research areas. You're most welcome to.
Yeah.